All right, so today we're going to be finishing off Jean Baudrillard's Fatal Strategies by looking at Chapter 4, The Object and Its Destiny, and Chapter 5, For a Principle of Evil. In these chapters, he's going to be talking about the seductive capacities of the object, as well as ritual and the place of chance. Now, in Chapter 4, Baudrillard lays out some of the advantages of an object approach to theory, which is opposed to the typical notion of subjects as our, this is what is liberatory, this is what we're acting on to try to free from desire or repression or castration. Instead, Baudrillard wants to focus on the strategy of the object, because he says that its secret is the object does not believe in its own desire. The object does not live off the illusion of its own desire. The object has no desire. It does not believe that anything belongs to it as property, and it entertains no fantasies or reappropriation or autonomy. The pure object is sovereign because it is what breaks up the sovereignty of the other and catches it in its own trap. The crystal takes revenge. And an important part that Baudrillard is trying to really problematize and also bring out in the object is the fact that the brute reality of an object, whether it is a material thing or some kind of hyper-real phenomenon, it really doesn't matter insofar as it has a fatal capacity latent within it that allows it, in its sort of brute objectivity, to break one up. And in doing this, it yields a special kind of power, which Baudrillard really brings out in some of his more accelerationist-sounding thought. He says the only radical and modern answer: potentiate what is new, original, unexpected in the commodity. For example, its formal indifference to utility and value, the preeminence given to circulation. That is what the work of art should be. It should adopt all the qualities of shock, strangeness, surprise, disquietude, liquidity, even autodestruction, the instantaneity and unreality which belongs to the commodity. The inhumanity of exchange value is to be exponentially multiplied in a kind of ecstatic but ironic orgasm over the indifferent ways of alienation. So in this postmodern condition of indifference, of being able to circulate commodities in this abstract notion of exchange value, Baudrillard asks us to find these basically accelerating parameters and continue to bring them out. And he wants to get us to an art that can bewilder, that can incite a sense of vertigo, which can move one beyond some law with a capital L. He says the work of art, a new and triumphant fetish, and not a sad alienated one, should work to deconstruct its own traditional aura, its authority and power of illusion, in order to shine resplendent in the pure obscenity of the commodity. It must annihilate itself as familiar object and become monstrously foreign. But this foreignness is not the disquieting strangeness of the repressed or alienated object. This object does not shine from its being haunted or out of some secret dispossession. It glows with a veritable seduction that comes from elsewhere, from having exceeded its own form and becoming pure object, pure event. So we've got a situation here where art is not trying to live up to some, you've got like realist art, which is trying to replicate the real. But Baudrillard would point out that in replicating the real, we're fetishizing the real in a sense of putting it on some pedestal, and by reproducing the real, we essentially have a real within a real, which is the original and then the copy, which at the height of realism would make the real and its copy identical, such that one could suffice with the copy just fine without the original. So the point is not to reach some ecstatic state of, oh, I've reached the truth, but rather it's to focus on the illusion of the pure form of art, not as representing something else, but as standing in its own brute objectivity, which is not to say its obviousness. This is not to reduce it to some kind of common sense, per se. As he goes on, he talks about the praise of the sexual object. And he quotes Sartre here, who says, "To seduce is to assume entirely, and as a risk to be run, my objectness for the other. I refuse to leave the terrain of my objectness. It is on this ground that I wish to engage the struggle by making myself into a fascinating object." And I think that's actually a really interesting addition here. And this is, of course, going back to kind of the subject-object split in phenomenology of, like, for example, Hegel's master-slave dialectic, where I am basically trying to fight for recognition and trying to wrest from the other some sort of objectivity of my existence, which requires them being their own object outside of me, a real, genuine difference. So there's this sort of play of how close can I get the other, how much can I subvert them without negating their very existence. And Sartre is pointing out here that in seduction, you almost turn yourself into a bare seductive object. You put yourself out there as an object to be done with as is interpreted by the one being seduced, for example. So there's a radical openness that's involved here, which can go to some quite interesting extremes. And Baudrillard mentions a story of the woman to whom a man has written a passionate letter, and who asks in her turn, "What part of me seduced you the most?" To which he replies, "Your eyes," and receives by return mail, wrapped in a package, the eye which seduced him. The beauty and violence of this defiance against the platitude of the seducer, but also the diabolism of this woman who takes revenge against the very wish to be seduced. Trap for trap, eye for eye. Never did punishment take so awful a form as in this unscrupulous offering. She loses an eye, but he loses face. How will he be able from now on to cast an eye on a single woman without being afraid of getting one in return? And this is the sort of acceleration of terms that Baudrillard wants to talk about. When it's found out that her eye seduced, she's going to respond with this fatalistic, caricatured response of, well, this is what you wanted, right? And, it just strikes you when reading that. And Baudrillard says as much. He, as subject, can play only the game of the metaphor. She, abjuring all metaphor, becomes the fatal object which drags the subject down to annihilation. So, he is confronted by the fact that this I is part of her, and somehow this seduced him. And it becomes an almost sickening question at this point of, well, why did that seduce me? But that's not the question. It's the fact of this rather comedic interplay that the objectness of the other is on display. And this is an important element of fatal strategies, which is that in this sort of accelerationist kind of logic, fatal strategies come in the form of a complex question fallacy. This would be like, when are you going to stop cheating on your husband? No matter which way you respond, you are in a sense acquiescing to and internalizing the assumption that you in fact were cheating on your husband, that I baked into my response. And of course, this is fallacious because if it's hidden well, it can allow you to hide assumptions and put them into a conversation and perhaps get someone to agree with you when maybe they don't. But also it requires, of course, the other person to backtrack or something, and it kind of ruins the spectacle of a debate or an argument. And this is exactly what happens, is there's some sort of seductive encounter where the stakes are being raised, like in gambling, as Baudrillard mentions throughout. And we get to this point where the stakes have been said in such a way that one cannot help but go down with the object, so to speak. One has no choice but to be sucked into the perverted logic of the game. Baudrillard says, in reference to this particular story, the object strategy, that of the woman, consists in interdicting the metaphorical displacement of discourse. So we're playing with that metaphorical aspect of very real objects. Baudrillard says signs become objects, impossible to turn into metaphors, cruel, without appeal. They cut short any decipherment, become confused with things, which is why fate is a dreamer, with the unintelligible instantaneity signs and words have in dreams. So when we respond with these fatal strategies, we operate in the symbolic register, but with real things, with objects, with pure commodities that are part of this seductive exchange, which isn't governed by some law, but rather by a sort of mythical transgression that occurs. And Baudrillard wants to respond to all of what has been said so far by saying that difference is always serious, but indifference is ironic. And I think what he's getting at here is that some sort of objective difference is always a very serious phenomenon, the kind like he's been talking about throughout of you must have an identity, you must be accountable to some sort of meaning or value. Instead, he wants to play with the indifference inherent in seduction. And he says you insult a child by being too sensitive to its age or strength. The child deep down knows he is not a child, and he is not concerned with the affectation of liberty and responsibility with which you wish to dignify him in order better to dignify the pedagogical difference between adult and child. He competes rather on equal terms. He's neither free nor inferior and leaves it to others to believe that. He envelops you with his shamelessness, for which precisely all means are justified. He can choose to play up difference, to play the fragile child facing the adult, and you then owe it to him to protect him, to valorize him, to attenuate the difference. Or else at any moment, he can choose to return you to the absence of difference, real and fundamental. Childhood doesn't exist. There is no child. He would be right in both cases. This confers upon him an absolute superiority. So right, baked within the role of the child, there is a fundamental ambiguity. This is the reason why we teach children, why we have to code into them behaviors and manners, ways of being in the world. And the there is no child is kind of reminiscent of there is no spoon in the Matrix. But really, the child is this model of the pure object which must be responded to by the parent, but can really exist on multiple registers. Now, Baudrillard has some really interesting thoughts when it comes to sexuality. He says everyone gets off in his or her own way. And the very possibility of sexuality lies on one premise, which is that the jouissance of the other escapes us. Therefore, there is no possession, for we wouldn't possess the other unless we felt their orgasm. Right? We can get infinitely close to one another in all sorts of very mapped out processes of, oh, you're going to last such and such amount of time, or you have so many matches on some dating app, or, you can have all these metrics, but ultimately there's going to be this primal affectation, which is particular to each subject, which rests within them and can't be shared, right? Your beingness is yours and cannot be outstripped. And he's going to take this to an interesting point where sexuality is strategic, and it's not about possessing, but rather it's about enacting. It's about opening up a hybrid space. He says, making of the opposite sex a destiny, making of it not a final object of orgasm, but a fatal object of death and metamorphosis. Because seduction plays on a register incomparable to anatomical or physical or psychological difference. Because it pushes the game of difference to the point of challenge and absolute attraction, to a vertigo where it is no longer a question of who comes 9 times more than the other, because it is a vertigo from raising the stakes and not from accounting. Because here the bets are placed according to a higher set of rules, which may not have any ends and certainly no computation of pleasures. A computation is forced to stop somewhere. Seduction alone can put an end to the domination of one sex over the other. So really, in this escalation of stakes, of the sexual encounter, for example, instead of treating it as some sort of, oh, I've got an end in mind of, completing the deed, so to speak, before actually entering into it, instead, we want to go into an action, and of course this is not specifically for intercourse, this could be for, really metaphorically, an intercourse with any kind of object or situation, in which we allow for the possibility, indeed accept the reality, that there is a small imminent factor of metamorphosis that threatens us, that will change us from our very core. And the fact that you can't compute jouissance, pleasure, drive, eros, whatever you want to call it, the fact that you have to stop at some point and just act shows that there is a hybridity that occurs by pushing the system to its limits and engaging with the other without talking past the other, but by becoming minoritarian, as Deleuze and Guattari would say it. He says, quite silly, the supreme orgasm is metamorphosis, which is to say that basically the height of our ecstasy as beings is fading into a cloud together with them. It's this radical unity through ambiguity, through indifference. And Baudrillard gives us a rather funny but interesting project, which I think it's good enough to ruminate on in abstract. I wouldn't necessarily say you should take this on, but in talking about the gray immanence, he says that the gray immanence is the art of making the other disappear. So it's engaging in these strategies in which the lines between me and you stops, or becomes blurred, rather. And this is his kind of funny little seductive exercise. First, follow people you meet in the street at random for an hour 2 hours, brief sequences, disorganized, with the idea that people's lives are arbitrary trajectories, directionless, going nowhere, and that for this very reason they are fascinating. The network of the other is used as a means of absenting yourself from yourself. You exist only in the other's trace, but without his knowledge. In fact, you follow your own trace almost without knowing it yourself. It is therefore not in order to discover something about the other, nor about where he's going, nor a drift in quest of some random aleatory course. All this, which corresponds to various contemporary ideologies, isn't particularly seductive, whereas this enterprise itself depends entirely upon seduction. And as he continues, you seduce yourself into being the destiny of the other, the double of his course, which for him has meaning, but which, duplicated, no longer has any. It's as if someone behind him knew that he was going somewhere. This is somehow stealing his objective from him. An evil genie comes and slips subtly between him and it. This is so magnetic that people often sense they're being followed through a sort of intuition that something has entered their space and has altered its curve. So here we're mapping a sort of anti-ideal trajectory that's creatively seductive and selective with regards to its paths. It's not focused on purpose, but rather bringing out the seductive banality of reality and not forcing it to mean anything. Allowing it to construct this creative path precisely by taking part, by merely witnessing. And what happens here is essentially there is an evil genie, a sort of seductive force per se, which is driving things forward, which is non-teleological, non-hierarchical, not structural, not representational. It's particular to an object and happens at the extremes. And in kind of another strange example, he mentions this lady S. S is the only name we have. And S learns that a man whom she barely knows from having followed him once by chance is taking a trip to Venice. She decides to follow him all through his voyage. Once in Venice, she explores 100 hotels and finally locates the one where he's staying. She rents a room with a window opposite so as to be able to follow his comings and goings. She has binoculars and a camera, and she photographs him on each occasion, the places he has gone, the objects he has touched. She expects nothing from him. She doesn't want to know him. She's not particularly attracted to him. And as this story goes on, we see there's a number of almost breaking encounters where he notices her following him. She follows him through all these streets and even back to Paris. And Baudrillard mentions that there is a secret capacity of the secret here, which allows for this whole thing to be constructed, right? This following only makes sense because of the secret. And she photographs him constantly. And Baudrillard says photography here has no perverse or archival function. It simply says, here, at such an hour, at such a place, under such a light, there was someone. And it says simultaneously, it made no sense to be here, at such a place and moment. In fact, there was no one, and I who followed him can guarantee no one was there. These are not the snapshot memories of a presence, but shots of an absence, that of the person followed, of the follower, and even of their absence from each other. And this is a sort of strategy of disappearance in broad daylight, in which the mere doubling of the real calls the real into question. The media is a favorite example of Baudrillard's, but by doubling the real event of, say, the siege on Gaza right now, it turns into a politically instrumentalized hyper-reality in which it can somehow hit people from all parts of the globe with a sort of reality that starts to be indistinguishable from the reality outside of media. Of course, these events impact our political lives, but there's a sort of loss in the directness of the event that's made up for in media, such that the distinction between reality and the hyper-reality of the realer than real, this instrumentalized, almost post-ideal form of communication, allows for a seduction to be present within pure events themselves. Pure objects themselves carry this evil genie in which, yes, we have an event, but we also have the breaking down of that event. And this plays into Baudrillard's theory in general, which is the simultaneous increase in volume of information and the banalization of the meaning of that information, such that saturation turns into a sort of affective indifference. And he says that is probably the secret of all seduction. It offers beauty, a deforming mirror where it is finally liberated from its perfection. More generally, it offers the other a strange mirror where it is finally liberated from its being, its liberty, its image, its resemblance. All things that in the secrecy of the self weigh heavily upon one. God himself is seduced by the devil. And I think this is actually really important because here the notions of being, of liberty, of resemblance, of being perfected, this represents the sort of weight of idealism, of references to these absolutes like truth and meaning and value, for example, or utility, that weigh down on the ability for seductive, mysterious, elusive encounters to take place. And what happens in seduction, in this sort of upping the ante to the nth degree, Baudrillard sees this as a way to get out from under the threat of idealism, in which one is simply liberated from a liberated position, from some absolute desire, so to speak. And something really interesting happens here, which is that Baudrillard is no longer a carrier sign, but a pure vector of appearance comes about. We are now going back to playing with appearances, which is, of course, precisely what the media does. But of course, what the media presents is real, right? Well, it's kind of this concatenation of the real and appearance, such that the difference is rather illusory. You know, we comfort ourselves with, oh, well, everyone's biased and you just have to choose the right source, as if news media today wasn't a giant corporate monopoly of like 5 companies owning 90% of the media companies. But something really interesting happens in seduction, which is really not a very complex process. It's supposed to be very brute and obvious, but at the same time, irreducible, and that's its power. And he says, as in the death at Samarkand, where he who thinks he's escaping, no matter where, is mistaken, because the other, death, knows where he's going and waits for him there. And this is in reference to a favorite little tale of mine, which is Death at Samarkand. And Samarkand is a sort of oasis in Uzbekistan. The mosques there are gorgeous. I mean, some of my favorite in terms of the distinctive domes of Uzbekistan. And in this story, it is narrated by Death, the personification of Death. And Death tells of this man who is in Baghdad, and he's in a market, and he brushes up against Death. And he says that Death gave him some sort of threatening look. And he knew that he was brushing up against Death, of course. He was brushing up against his end. So he ran away to Samarkand, which is a long way, going from Baghdad in Iraq to Samarkand in Uzbekistan, way up north. And when he gets there, Death says, well, no, that wasn't a look of like standoffishness. In fact, it was a look of surprise, because I had a meeting with you tonight in Samarkand. So there's this sort of funny play of the ambiguity of looks, where the character who's trying to avoid his death actually falls into his death, precisely because of the ambiguity with death itself, the ambiguity of communication, where the object really carves out a destiny of disappearance and death, where the object has a fatalistic consequence. And Baudrillard says it's not enough for a story to be illogical and meaningless to be seductive. It is still necessary that this be signaled in an unintelligible way. So that unintelligibility, of course, is at the heart of the story of Death at Samarkand, which makes it so interesting. As he moves into this subchapter on the crystal revenge, he makes some interesting critiques against psychoanalysis. He says, we were all once produced, we must all be seduced. That is the only true liberation, that which opens beyond the Oedipus complex and the law, and which delivers us from a stern psychological Calvary, as well as from the biological fatality of having been sexually engendered. So rather than being reduced to biological determinist, structures of, oh, this is how such and such ought to be, and they will be categorized as male or female, or as having a micropenis or enlarged clitoris, all these different terms to account for irregularities. And it's also not reducible to structures of the unconscious, like the Oedipus complex or Lacan's phallus even. Really, true liberation, quote unquote, comes from a liberation that doesn't complete itself, which is exactly what seduction is. It's an encounter, but as he says, it is the encounter, the surprise of what exists before you, outside of you, without you. The marvelous exteriority of the pure object, of the pure event, of what happens without your having anything to do with it. Which is interesting because without you having anything to do with it is both in the sense of it's rather indifferent to you, but also this indifference strikes you profoundly as something that comes from without to you and encounters you, but doesn't give over the reins, so to speak. And Baudrillard mentions that psychoanalysis is sworn to an insular economy, as he puts it. A pure instinctual enclosure destined to administer its own desire, to distribute its investments, to invent its object relations, to fantasize about its image. That is, a being for whom everything will basically happen from the inside, and an essentially individual process, and nothing from the outside in a dual process. So right, when we focus on these ideal structures, and this doesn't just have to play out for desire of, this is what desire really ought to be, or this could occur for meaning or value or utility or liberty. What happens when we reduce these questions to some essentially abstract reference is that we forestall the process of a dualism, of an almost satirical indifference with a reality that really presents itself and isn't reduced to some sort of objective category. He mentions that Freud, in his analyses, basically has to make dreams mean something, whereas in actuality, dreams produce their own seductive tale that is not reducible to repeating the structures of the unconscious that were pre-social, the Oedipus complex or whatever it may be. Instead, to counter this notion that dreams have to mean something, that they are burdened by a question of interpretation. Freud loved to interpret dreams. Instead, he quotes Canetti as saying, dreams must animate reality by penetrating it in every possible way, by coming from all possible directions, and especially from where we least expect them. The intangible nevertheless has its form, fashioned by its insertion into reality, and we shouldn't impose one on it from the outside. Right? We're not imposing categories or signifiers. And Baudrillard says psychoanalysis is the bad conscience of the sign. It transforms every sign into symptom, every act into a slip, every discourse into hidden meaning, every representation into a hallucination of desire. This incredible nearsightedness of analytical interpretation. Against the seductive power of thought, psychoanalysis incarnates the omnipotence of hidden motives. Suspicion toward appearance, blackmail by symptom and hidden meaning, the solution of the enigma. Psychoanalysis absolutely participates in the misfortune, in the bad conscience that Nietzsche identified as the source of all backward worlds. And I think that notion of hiding hidden motives is really important. This is something that Deleuze and Guattari in Anti-Oedipus and in One or Several Wolves in 1,000 Plateaus, they bring out that really there is a lot of hidden motives behind Freud's analysis that are really, they're connected to a sort of conservative logic of sexuality, of gender roles, of how we relate to our environment, and Baudrillard doesn't have any time for this, right? This is just bad conscience for him. And this is just what happens when we insist that, everything has to have a meaning. Everything has to account for something. Everything has to have some solution. Which baked into that, the notion that we always need a solution, not only implies some perfected state, but it in effect implies that we will always never have reached it. That will always be in a perpetual process of trying to catch up to something that, it doesn't exist. Now, he comes back to something that he's been saying throughout, which is to use the gambler as really a form for, what does seduction look like in practice? And he mentions that the gambler is looking for chain reaction, charming catastrophe. There's a sense of, oh, something clicked and now all these good things are happening. It's as if by magic, right? He says all strategy in the sphere of the game is aimed at provoking a de-escalation of rational causes and an inverse escalation of magical linkage. Not one lucky occasion, then another throw by throw, the famous equiprobability of chance at every throw, but on the contrary, a fatal sequence of lucky throws or unlucky throws. What is essential is not to win, but to be fatal, to trap fate in its own game, where nothing can any longer arrest the production of a world given up to the pure solicitation of the mind. So, right, there's this almost ecstatic breaking point that, no doubt this is what keeps people in gambling, is that ecstasy of having outdone rationality, having outdone the world and gotten however many hands in a row of good cards, or I'm not a gambler, I don't really know the terminology, but it's that process in which a point is surpassed at which you can't help but be enthralled while knowing the profound ill-likelihood of what is happening. He says, whether poetry or theory, it's nothing but the projection of an arbitrary code, an arbitrary system, an invention of the rules of a game, where things come to be taken in their fatal development. And that's really important because not only is he highlighting that things are arbitrary in a good way, but he's pointing out the fact that we are not necessarily traveling temporally in a series of events, as if we're going point to point to point along a lily pad when it comes to theory or when it comes to any creative practice. Instead, we're always in this process of development where the distance between one path and the next, or between one point and the next, we're always in the process of deciding that. And as I mentioned in the last lecture, there's always a little bit of ambiguity in the event, which makes it so exciting. And within the game especially, that makes it so exciting is there's always some sort of point where you're like, well, this wasn't in the rules, what do we do now? And you are forced to creation. You're forced to some sort of comedic situation. And this comedy is brought out in a really interesting example that Baudrillard gives. He says, in a dream, I have just emerged from a terrible but enigmatic period of mourning. Someone tells me that the mourning actually passed quite quickly. I reply that it's always like that, and everyone around me bursts into manic laughter. I've unleashed a kind of laughing catastrophe, and through this coincidence between the little I've said and its exaggerated effect, I feel mysteriously swept aside, erased. What was it I unleashed without knowing it? Or rather, into what prodigious relation have I entered without wanting to? A connection that can only depend on exactly what I've said. Not on what I am, not even on the dream situation. It must depend precisely upon the insignificance of my words and their very banality. So, right, he didn't say anything particularly funny in the dream, or at least in the way that it's conveyed here in the text. But bringing out the comedy within language itself, Baudrillard is just struck with the fact that there was something funny about these words without them being funny. And, it leads to a feeling of being alienated from a joke, like you just don't get it. But maybe that's the point, is that there are things you never really fully get. And that is the real comedy behind seduction, as Baudrillard points it, which is that there's a sort of mystery that makes it so exciting. And one of the problems I have when reading Baudrillard and when figuring out how his theory, which is indeed radical, how it fits into the world, I'm perplexed by, of course, its abstractness. And, Baudrillard is very quick. He's not metaphysical. He deems his work pataphysical, which is to say the science of imaginary solutions. So, in a sense, I respect it for establishing its lane. And there are moments throughout these, 90 pages, of which I'm skipping a lot, which just strikes me as unhelpful. It's just kind of needlessly abstract, kind of loosely conjugated ideas. But he says anything is better than this mental cruelty of a world entirely ruled by the omnipotence of thought. And here, chance is quite helpful. It's enough to think, difficult as it is, that things happen without reason, or for a maximum of objective reasons, technical, material, satirical, that remove the responsibility from us and which, in fact, absolve us from whatever the events could contain of a profoundly seductive nature, whose cause we might have wanted to be. For we would like to be the reason for anyone's death, as for anyone's life or good fortune. And there is nothing revolting about this. It does not mean we want anyone to die, but we prefer to have wanted it than to have it happen by accident. So there's this commitment here to the act of thinking, of surpassing reason, as a transgression worth partaking in and of itself. And it's only moderately convincing to me. It strikes me as a very privileged way of thinking, but it's definitely interesting. And one of the things that I think is really trippy about Baudrillard's philosophy, this is on page 198 of the semiotext edition, because I think it's particularly enigmatic, but potentially interesting, assuming I'm maybe not getting the depth out of it that is necessary. He says, the fact that things are in advance of the unfolding of their causes, their procession in time, this is their secret. It is the secret of their seduction and also that which prevents the real from ever occurring. For the real is only the coincidence in time of an event and a causal sequence. And really what he's saying here is that effects precede causes. And really this is a critique of history as a discipline in general that is shared definitely by Deleuze and Guattari in May 68 did not take place. But both of the thinkers point out, both Baudrillard and Deleuze and Guattari, that oftentimes causality in history, for example, when with regards to May 68, is an ad hoc way to lump together a bunch of things into a proper event. And this is a little bit reductionistic in terms of Baudrillard's thought. He's trying to point out the inexhaustibility of things by temporality or causality, that in a sense there is something which happened before we could put a name on it, or in spite of us putting a name on it, which leads to a very interesting way of thinking about theory, in which he says, going faster than the conceptual connections. This is the secret of writing. So going faster than the conceptual connections. It's almost like preemptively going beyond what a concept entails, taking it to some new radical extreme that, as he says, is neither causality nor determinism, but rather reversion and reversibility. And as he finishes up, he circles back to pataphysics for just a second, and he does it just in a little parenthetical instance. He says, why search for plausibility in imaginary stories? So, right, there's a sort of, well, it doesn't really matter if it's plausible. Is it theoretically interesting? Does it provide some sort of novel way of looking at the world? And Baudrillard suggests, instead of consigning ourselves to the comic sight of a liberty grappling with the problem of its own foundation, let us return rather to the tragedy of the purely arbitrary. So, right, let's not try to overcode this existence that we're in with some sort of notion of absolute liberty. Because, of course, that's impossible, because in order for something to exist, in order for it to function, it must be strapped down by certain rules of engagement, so to speak. How does this thing function in relation to these other things? How does that form into a system? And sure, we can revolt against those systems, but Baudrillard has been questioning throughout, what do those kind of naive liberal notions, what do those say about the people that our society is reproducing today through the proliferation of models, through things to replicate? And instead, maybe we should just stop worrying about this ideality. Instead, he wants to go back to the ceremony. This is, sort of like a tribal, ritualistic ceremony. He says the ceremony contains the presentiment of its development and its end. It has no spectators. Wherever there is spectacle, ceremony ceases, for it is also violence against representation. The space where it moves is not a stage, a scene, a space of scenic illusion. It is a locus of immanence and of the unfolding of the rule. Ceremony is not the order of pleasure, it is the order of power, which it possesses by virtue of the immanence in each of its signs and actors of its development, and not by virtue of some kind of transcendence of aesthetic judgment. So I think he's trying to point out here just a sort of sober contact, which is within the ceremony, that the ceremony invades the space and draws everything in, but not in a spectacle, because it's not just something you watch, it's something you engage in. You have to, dance, you have to put on masks, and this leads Baudrillard to a rather joyful depiction of theory and the way we operate as thinkers, in which he says the game is based on this possibility for every system to overflow its own reality principle and to be refracted in another logic. This is the secret of illusion, and this is at stake. What is at stake is always to rescue this vital dimension. And this vital dimension, this other logic, this is the logic of the evil genie, so to speak, or as he calls it in this last chapter, a principle of evil. And in this last chapter, he says there is perhaps but one fatal strategy, and only one: theory. And doubtless the only difference between a banal theory and a fatal theory is that in one strategy, the subject still believes himself to be more cunning than the object, whereas in the other, the object is considered more cunning, cynical, talented than the subject for which it lies in wait. The metamorphoses, the ruses, the strategies of the object surpass the subject's understanding. The object is neither the double nor the repressed of the subject, neither its fantasy nor its hallucination, neither its mirror nor its reflection. It has its own strategy and holds the key to the rules of a game, impenetrable to the subject, not because they are deeply mysterious, but because they are infinitely ironic. So, right, the reason that a fatal strategy is so effective for Baudrillard is because it goes beyond our logic of causality and temporality and meaning and objectivity. Instead, a sort of pure object is reached, which breaks down the concept of an object as such, and it doesn't duplicate some real that existed, but rather plays in this third space, so to speak. He says, this is how a principle of evil, with a capital E, exists. Not as a mystical process and transcendence, but as a hideout for the symbolic order, as the theft, the rape, the receiving of stolen goods, and the ironic embezzlement of the symbolic order. This is how the object is transparent to the principle of evil. Unlike the subject, it is a poor conductor of the symbolic order, but a good conductor of the fatal. That is to say, of a pure objectivity, sovereign and incorrigible, immanent and enigmatic. And this reminds me in Symbolic Exchange and Death when he's talking about these radical practices of these graffiti artists who use all these weird names that just totally break the rules of what is a name supposed to be, what does a name symbolize. And this is really an ambiguity in transmission and in transgression, which it's almost like a unique STD. It presents a fatality which is latent within seduction itself, latent within our, height of our human existence in sexual love, which always runs the risk of destroying us. And Baudrillard says, we need to be respectful of the inhuman. This is the way of certain cultures, which we call fatalist, as a way of condemning them, without trial, because they found their commandments on the side of the inhuman, on the side of the stars, or of an animal god, of constellations or faceless divinities. A grand choice, that of a faceless divinity. Nothing is less like our own modern and technical iconolatry. And really, this is a post-humanist message, which is very similar to, in a sense, Becoming Animal in Deleuze and Guattari's work. It's, okay, let's take ourselves out of the human domain if we want to figure out what creativity really is. And in doing so, we can figure out some new strategies that maybe we haven't even considered yet. And it's important to explain that these strategies are not laid out. It's not some theory of everything, like when Foucault says in the preface of Anti-Oedipus that it's not a flashy Hegel. It's not a pre-laid out project, and in fact the ambiguity is what makes it so exciting. Baudrillard says nothing can guarantee us a fatality, even less a strategy. What is more, the conjunction of these two terms is paradoxical. How could there be fatality if there is strategy? That's just the point. The enigma is that fatality is at the heart of every strategy. It's what peeks through the heart of more banal strategies. It's the object whose fatality would be a strategy, something like the rule of another game. Basically, the object mocks the laws we attach to it. It would rather figure in our calculations as a sarcastic variable and leave it to the equations to verify themselves. Seduction is fatal. It's the effect of a sovereign object that recreates in you an original confusion and seeks to surprise you. Fatality, in turn, is seductive, like the discovery of a hidden rule. The discovery of a hidden rule of the game is dazzling and compensates us in advance for the cruelest losses. So I hope this has been useful in getting a sense of Jean Baudrillard's work. This concludes our lecture series on this work. I hope you'll take a look at some of the other stuff I've done on Baudrillard, on postmodernism, feminism, German idealism. Leave any constructive or non-constructive criticism in the comments below, and I'll see you in another lecture.